everybody, and welcome to Commodity Culture, where our goal is to make you a better investor in the commodities space. My name is Jesse Day. Before we dive in, standard disclaimer, nothing here is investment advice. Do your own due diligence. We bring you the information, you do the research. And today's guest is a partner at Von Greyer's, a former hedge fund manager and the author of Rigged to Fail. It's someone I always love talking to, Matthew Piepenburg. Welcome back to the show.
Oh, it's always great to be here. Looking forward to the conversation as usual.
Yes, and very much appreciate having you here in your injured state. Maybe give us a little bit of insight into what happened before we dive in.
Oh, I don't think anyone's going to feel sorry for me. I just was being an idiot, riding very fast, and my horse rolled over me and broke a couple of my ribs, and it came out of nowhere. And so I was joking with you before. Hopefully, the painkillers won't make me too off the wall today. But yeah, this just happened over the weekend. So I'm out of the saddle for 6 weeks or so, but yeah, brain hopefully is still working.
Well, really appreciate you showing up in your injured state. This is incredible.
No problem.
I want to start with something really interesting that you wrote at the opening of a recent article on Von Greyer's called How to Hedge Anti-Heroes. You wrote, how does one hedge against open stupidity? Left, right, or center, our policymakers from parliaments and executive branches to central banks and think tanks have taken the world closer to war, immigration disasters, infrastructure failures, credit traps, wealth inequality, social unrest, and currency destruction than any other time in recent memory. So expand on that, unpack that for us. What are you seeing right now that has you with all of these concerns?
Yeah, I think that quote was from an article which was hopefully a qualified, objective, empirical rant. All of us are feeling a little frustrated, left, right, or center, with the state of the world right now, and there's a lot of polarization. And you know, 30. I like to start at 30,000 feet and then come into specific examples. But this is a syllogism and an historical template that I've used over and over, right, just without exception. And we start from there. We can break down that quote. But as I've always said, without exception, going all the way back in history, whenever a nation, an empire, an oligarchy, a monarchy, a regime of any form or color, political stripe, gets itself into a debt trap, which America and the West in general, America in particular, and the world in allgemein is clearly in a debt trap. Whenever you're in a debt crisis like this, where your debt to GDP gets subtract and gets unsustainable, that always leads to some type of credit market problem, long durated treasuries in this particular case, but throughout history, some version of a debt crisis, a credit crisis, which usually leads to an economic or market crisis, which always leads to some type of debasement or inflation. And that inflation leads to social unrest. And that social unrest is always followed up by extremism, centralization from whoever's in power, the political left or the political right. And that's kind of the symptom I was kind of opening up with, but the examples get far more specific. That's just an overall statement throughout history, this movement from debt to centralization, to less and less liberties, freedoms, and common sense. And you know, in this article and other articles, I use it. It's not just Matt Piepenburg on a rant in Switzerland. You know, Hemingway said this, that you know, whenever a country gets into so much debt, political opportunists will resort to short-term, you know, short-term joys through inflating the markets, inflating the currency, debasing the currency, and then distracting us with war. I think we're very much in a Hemingway scenario right now. David Hume said in 1752, when you get to a certain debt level, when your debt to GDP crosses 100%, growth dies by 1/3 mathematically. So debt does destroy nations. This isn't something new. This is historical. That's from the 18th century. And of course, von Mises and the Austrian school at the turn of the century warned that whenever you have a credit expansion of this magnitude, you can't avoid debasement of the currency. And so with that as the setting, this backdrop of debt to centralization to nation destroying policies, I then, in that article that you referred to, tried to create some archetypes out of politics, out of the central banks, and out of Wall Street to show how this is literally not sensational. This is happening right now. And I gave examples, and we could spend 45 minutes on each, but you know, Woodrow Wilson in 1913 signed the Fed into law. That was a very big watershed in American history when the Fed became a fourth branch of government. Frankly, unconstitutional. They made it constitutional, but if you look at the history of that and the history of Jekyll Island, he was really coerced into doing that. So that was the example of Wilson, I used FDR and Nixon. But what I was trying to say in each of those examples with more detail is there's a template here of solving a debt crisis with more debt paid for with debased money to stay in power. And that template, sadly, is being replayed today. Then I gave a specific example on Alan Greenspan. He's kind of, to me, the patient zero of Fed out of control, the punch bowl effect of low rates, or QE, the Bernanke fouled with. Again, you could spend an hour on Greenspan or Powell or Bernanke or Yellen and what the Fed has done to completely distort free market price discovery and debase the currency. I use the example of John Merriweather at long-term capital management with a very famous smart hedge fund that got caught over its skis and over leverage and caused a market crisis. I use the example of Leo Malamud and Larry Summers with the derivative markets and using excessive leverage and derivative instruments of mass destruction to lead us into market crises. And so each of these are kind of sickening examples, from politics to central banks to Wall Street, but each somehow become normalized today or forgotten or misunderstood. And again, you could do the same with Yankee, Bernallen, or Powell, that we're in this debt trap. The central banks have put us in this debt trap. Politicians have put us in this debt trap. Wall Street has helped put us in this debt trap. And as Larry Lepard said better than anyone I know, you can't taper a Ponzi scheme. What we've done to our currency, what we've done to supply and demand, what we've done to risk asset market bubbles is here to stay. And the idea that modern monetary theory is a solution, printing money to no end to solve a debt crisis. Well, modern monetary theory is neither modern nor monetary nor a theory. It's been tried in 1720. It's been tried in 1789. It's been tried in Weimar. It's been tried throughout history. It always fails. And so when you go back to that original quote, these things that we're seeing now, war, immigration, distraction, debt traps, social unrest, this is nothing new in history. And trillions in QE inflated assets. The stock market, when Bernanke began printing out of control and the central bankers have been all lockstep and followed, despite some tightening by Powell, that QE led not just to CPI inflation risk, but to inflation in stock and bond markets. And it's important for people to understand in this article, which is talking about these problems, 90% of that wealth is really held by the top 10%. That in and of itself is a problem. Since 1978, CEO compensation in America has gone up 940%, where worker compensation is only going up 12%. Again, I'm not trying to be communist or Marxist. I'm not saying that, but that's not good capitalism for me, and I'm a capitalist. Since 1965, the CEO to media employees ratio of salary went from 22 to 1 to 320 to 1. And in Jeff Bezos's case, it went to 1.2 million to 1. So there's an extreme kind of psychopathy here in wealth inequality, in a kind of a galvanization. We've got basically two Americas. During COVID, when most of America was shut down and locked down and small businesses were failing, more billionaires were made. And you need to get into how this happens. This article about anti-heroes, whether they're on Wall Street, whether they're in Washington, D.C., in politics, or in central banks, there is evidence to suggest that they're highly involved in this. So we really have two Americas. And I think we can distract the masses with bread and circus, Monday Night Football, Facebook, whatever, or division through identity politics, gender, race, transgender bathroom debates on the margins. But we're really missing the economic and kind of power-hungry distortion that we've seen in these three circles, in Wall Street, in politics, and at the central banks. And of course, war is the most dangerous of all. Since I was born, since Vietnam to today, America's been in either a direct or indirect war as long as I can remember. Not going to get into a debate about Ukraine. Not here to do that at all. It doesn't matter. I think John Mearsheimer has done a very good job of showing, though, that this war was completely avoidable, and that the mainstream media message is truncated at best and biased at worst. I think the fact that we don't have an America like we did when Gore Vidal could argue with William Buckley about things with intelligent debate, as opposed to purely political bias debate or emotional debate, is sad. So it goes back to your question, how did we get to all these problems? I think the evidence is fairly clear. The wealth inequality, the social unrest, the political gamesmanship, the opportunism, it all comes from what happens when a country's got its back against a wall in debt, gets more and more desperate, and you really have a divided country, not just in terms of red versus blue or left versus right, but rich versus poor. Those in the inside who can make decisions to their benefit at the expense of the majority. I think the evidence of that is pretty much everywhere today. And that's the anti-heroes that I was trying to kind of bring to the surface to inform people about in that article, which clearly has my biases, but I think the evidence is pretty empirical in favor of it, pretty objective, that we really do have two Americas. We have a debt-strapped America, and we're going to have an America of inflation and war.
Hey guys, just a quick break to hear from today's sponsor, ARC Silver Gold Osmium. They offer personalized service and competitive prices with no minimum purchase for silver, gold, platinum, or osmium. Here's just some of the comments left on this YouTube channel about ARC SGO and owner Ian Everard. Have bought from ARC, good source and price. I cannot say enough good about Ian and his company. He is the most honest individual I could find in order to buy precious metals. If you are looking to buy precious metals, I recommend Ian at ARC Silver. He is a straight shooter. So go to arcsgo.com and contact Ian Everard today at 307-264-9441 or by email at ian@arcsgo.com, and make sure to tell him that Commodity Culture sent you. Well, I'm going to put a link to that article in the description below so people can read it in full. You mentioned the bread and circuses, the distraction of the citizens through war, through, different type of identity politics, dividing people based on race, gender, etc. It seems like, to me, many citizens in countries all around the world are as ignorant as ever today. Zero understanding of how money works, how energy is generated, how politicians are often depriving them of rights. I mean, I was in this situation myself. I always suspected something sinister was going on, but before COVID hit, I was kind of blissfully ignorant. I don't want to deal with that. Politics is too complicated. Who cares? And I kind of woke up once the whole COVID situation came into play. I suspect some other people did as well. But how do we turn these things around and get people to see the real source of the problems? Because it feels like a battle that can't be won. Like when you look at, the interesting thing is, I find that for people like us who are interested in personal sovereignty, who do not like government overreach, I mean, for me anyways, we always like to think our side is winning. So when we're on social media, when we're on YouTube, we gravitate to those voices and those videos where people align with our interests and what we believe. And we see, oh, they've got all these views. We read all the people in the comments and we think, wow, maybe the tide is turning. But I've gone down the other rabbit hole on purpose and looked at the other exact opposite side, where people want more government overreach, where they don't understand what's going on. And it's actually just as big, if not bigger, in terms of the comments, the views, etc. So is the only way through this, through some sort of collapse? Is it going to take just a tremendous amount of economic pain for people to kind of drop the whole gender identity politics, the whole, just the whole mess that we found ourselves in at this point? How can the tides turn at this point?
I mean, that's the question, right? And to your point, I think it's very important. You're right. We all live in our own little echo chambers, and tend to, if we get more informed about the math and the history, we tend to think we're corroborated by those things. So we're right. To your point, if you take the other side and just look at people who are very emotional, stressed financially, want to be protected, have faith in government, have faith in institutions, have faith in the buildings, they tend to ignore a lot of those empirical facts and just believe, not necessarily because they're stupid, but because they trust. So you don't want to mock another side. And some are just angry, marginalized, and desperate. So they're just bitter. And you could argue that's the whole definition of the woke movement. Others would take offense to that, but they're not technically, in my opinion, very informed. You talk about how money works, how energy is generated. How can we get bankers and politicians to take accountability? How can we get the people to understand this? Without some type of real messy chaos, social unrest type revolution, quasi-violent solution, which is not a best case scenario for anyone. Never works. It always leads to worse scenarios. I mean, the answer to that, Jess, is pretty Pollyannish in some sense. Of course, it requires people to be informed. That doesn't mean to agree with me. I don't agree with Larry Lepard on Bitcoin versus gold, but he's extremely smart. He's extremely modest. That's a good discussion. When we have very similar macro views, and he could be absolutely right about Bitcoin. And I don't entirely agree with Brent Johnson on the milkshake theory. I think it's a brilliant theory. It worked pre-2019, pre-2022. I don't necessarily agree, but I certainly respect his opinions and respect that I could be wrong. I think we have a lot of common denominators there in an informed debate. like Buckley and Vidal, that can be very helpful. We just don't have that much today. So 20% tend to think with math and science and history and try to be unemotional, objective. But to your point, if you step outside your little echo chamber, a lot of the world is just emotional and confused. And I get that. So can we get the world to understand what is money? Even Bitcoin and gold debates can't figure out what is money. There's still not a common ground. You could say it's a store of value or medium of exchange. To Brent Johnson's points, whatever the government says it is. And I think if people understood that, okay, despite all the nuances and wonky language of money, money does need a chaperone. If you create too much of something, it dilutes its value. If you add water to wine, it dilutes the flavor. So if people could just understand the basics of money, when you take away a gold chaperone, because America's been on and off the gold standard, when they get in and out of debt problems, they need to print more money or create more money at will. If they just understand the basics of sound money, whether you're left, right, or center or not, you'll see we have a problem since 1971, when we welched on the promise from 1944 to have a gold-backed dollar, and the world had to take our dollar because we just, with Russia, helped defeat fascism in World War II. So if you just understand the basic understanding of having a chaperone to dollar, some type of sound money, you don't have to get political. You'll see that we're in real trouble right now, just with our monetary system. And again, not getting all the wonky QE, QT, interest rate policies, Fed history. We needed a chaperone. If people in America understood how the Fed was even born, the context of that, just one book, if you read The Creature from Jekyll Island, again, doesn't matter your politics. That's informative. That's not kooky conspiracy theory. It's like a Tom Clancy novel. It's coercive. It's where banks and individuals with the will to power that would make Nietzsche blush became constitutionally allowed to be a fourth branch of government. That's wrong. If you understood Glass-Steagall, which was brought into law in 1933 to keep banks from using your deposits for leverage, well, that was repealed in 1999. That's a watershed moment. You don't have to be left or right, pro-government or anti-government, to be informed about these watershed moments in our monetary policy and our banking history. And then, of course, if you really understand the Fed and Glass-Steagall and how it was born, you'll know its real mandate isn't just employment and inflation. Its real mandate is Wall Street, the smaller banks that it serves, and keeping the treasury market alive. And they'll do that by debasing money. Well, debasing money affects every citizen in America or any country where there's a central bank debasing money. So again, that should not be a political or ideological debate. That's just sound basic common sense and math. And again, to your question, how do we avoid revolution? How do we make these bankers and politicians accountable? Well, you'd have to get a population that's informed enough to demand this. And Churchill famously said that the U.S. will always do the right thing after they've exhausted every other alternative. And so leadership has to be honest for the people then to also push hard questions. I think the problem we have in America and around the world today, and certainly in Europe, I see it in France, I see it in Germany. The problem we have is trust is gone. The trust is dying, and we could talk about democracy, et cetera. And you see that in the U.S. in particular with like this singer from Farmville, Virginia. He's not a Harvard, Yale grad. He's not Wall Street. He's not the Fed. He just wrote this song about rich men north of Richmond destroying his dollar and destroying our country. Well, then you could take an Ivy League educated guy like Eric Weinstein, who'll have the same thing. The trust is gone. After COVID, this silver spike in the history of our country, these lockdowns, for him, the CDC, NIH, they're dead to me now after something like that. So you can be an intellectual, you can be obsessed with these data points, or you can be a guitar player in Virginia. So you still feel it's off. You still feel this distrust. And that's where we're at right now. Again, that goes back to the syllogism. When you get to social unrest, when you get to inflation, which is economic, and you're broke or you're stressed or you're controlled, left or right, rich or poor, you feel something off in the universe. So again, whether it's Brett or Eric Weinstein or Oliver Anthony, I think these are very important turning points. And it's a dystopia to think that technology, this is the new meme, that technology is going to save us. It's the same thing. AI is going to save us. It's just mega computing. Again, I'm not going to get into the weeds on that, but think of a world like a Starbucks in South Korea. They're bragging that they have 100 robots and 2 employees. Well, what does that really mean? How is that a good solution? That's dystopian. That's inflationary. The employees that you lose are going to need to be subsidized in some way. You're going to have to create more money out of nowhere to support that social system. So again, we have a lot of distrust in our government. We have a lot of fake solutions, a lot of distractions. We have some dangerous distractions like war. We have some fancy distractions like robots are going to save us. That's, to me, it's appalling. And then we have political grandstanding, which is just becoming more and more empty slogans. That, to your point, if you go on the other side, some people still want to believe those slogans. They want to believe those slogans because they feel good. But if you do go under the hood of that and look at the math and the history and the templates and the objective consequences of these type of policies, this type of debt and this type of centralization, it doesn't end well. It just doesn't.
Yeah, absolutely agree with you there. It's very interesting because one of the videos I went on was a Kamala Harris Tim Walz rally video on YouTube. Now, I'm going to make some people angry in the comments. I do not believe Trump is fit to be president either. But given those two options, I would say from an objective point of view, yes, Trump is divisive. His rhetoric is at times very, difficult to accept. So I get it. He's very emotion provoking. But Kamala clearly is the lesser of the two candidates, I would say. It might not even be by a wide margin, but the comment section of this YouTube video of her rally, which had millions of views and tons of comments, was saying things like Tim Walz gives off happy grandpa energy. Do you see Kamala's tan suit? She's just so powerful and shining. And they were getting crazy amounts of likes and other people commenting. And I'm just thinking, yes, you also see that on the Trump side, where people are just, he's going to drain the swamp, he's going to do this and that, and yet he goes ahead and hires people from the swamp in his last administration as well. So, I mean, it's a very fascinating situation for sure. Now, aside from the actual citizens, who a lot of seem to be kind of ignorant to the facts and to history, etc., those who control the infrastructure of the world, the governments, the nonprofit organizations, the big corporations, Google is one that I think is interesting to point out because they essentially in many ways control the internet. They control this platform we're speaking on right now, which is YouTube, and they are all seem to be aligned in the same direction. So, X being one of the only social media platform that at least claims to be for free speech. There's some interesting theories that Musk has actually controlled opposition, etc. Who knows what's really going on behind the scenes? There seems to be a monopoly here. What are your thoughts? And this is, again, another obstacle. How can that all come crashing down and, free speech prevail in the end?
Well, the truth will set you free, and the truth is an amorphous term. And then, to your point, it can be the truth for Biden, it can be the truth for Harris, it can be the truth for Santa Claus, which is whatever. And it's very complicated. But I think there is such a thing as objective truth and quantifiable truth and historical templates. In terms of the solution, I mean, there definitely seems to be an alignment of power, a monopoly of power. And again, smarter people than me have gone deeper into the weeds on this. I mean, even when I was in law school and I studied the Clayton Act or the Sherman Act, these principles of antitrust. I mean, the metaphor of monopoly is everywhere today. Monopoly in government, monopoly at the DOJ, monopoly in tech, monopoly at the military-industrial complex, monopoly in big pharma. But how does this get solved? Again, it's Pollyannish and probably improbable, because it requires a basic discipline to understand these forces. And that's why groups like platforms like yours or articles like mine are trying to get more and more traction, not so you can believe what Jesse Day thinks or what Matt Piepenburg thinks, but just look at these things and make your own conclusions. I mean, America, all Americans would agree. I use America because I'm an American. I've been half of my life overseas, which I think actually helps my perspective on America. But there's an ideal in America or in the West of a free society of equal opportunity. That doesn't mean equal outcomes, but equal playing field. The government is to ensure that fair pursuit of happiness, a fair pursuit of happiness. And what I've been seeing over the last 20 years is more of a feudalistic America or Europe and not a capitalistic or democratic one. And I've tried to show that empirically. When you look at coalition governments in Canada, where Trudeau clearly isn't the majority, or Macron is not the majority, or Schultz is not the majority, or in Japan, when you look at it mathematically, whoever's in power in these places actually does not have the consent of the majority. So that in of itself makes you question democracy. When you see the wealth inequality, which I just talked about on Wall Street in the US and in Europe too, but mostly in the US in particular, never been higher wealth inequality. That's not capitalism, that's feudalism. That's a minority of powerful corporations and families running those corporations that are embedded into the political system and the power. That's not sensational, that's a fact. And the documents designed to protect people from government. And in the US, it's obviously the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. In Europe, it's the Declaration of the Rights of Man or the Magna Carta. These things, these documents are becoming museum pieces. They're beautiful in concept. They masquerade and they show these principles of our founding fathers, but the practice of them, clearly the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, our Bill of Rights, through euphemisms like the Patriot Act or the Department of Homeland Security, these things are taking away those bills of rights, those habeas corpus, Caesar, even the First Amendment, free speech, which we can talk about, or even the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, to really to protect you against your government, are all under threat now. Very slowly but surely, in a crisis opportunity scenario, every crisis is an opportunity to take away more rights. That's more centralization. The institutions designed to protect us from our government, to give us more freedoms. That was the three branches of government, the checks and balances. Well, again, you don't have to take my word for it, but very smart people who are not political, like Mike Lufgren, have written a book on the dark state. It's empirically clear that a small number of corporations are making decisions and not the elected representatives. And how the dark state works, how the CDC works, how the NIH works, we've seen that in 2020. We've lost that trust. This isn't sensational. This isn't an exaggeration. The law is designed to protect freedom and free opportunity and equal opportunity. And those are the antitrust laws, the regulation agencies. Again, the Bill of Rights, free speech, habeas corpus, the Patriot Act, Homeland Security. Now, anything that disagrees with the government, you're a domestic terrorist. There's no free speech. You can be arrested in the UK for having an opinion that doesn't go. Again, that should be bothersome to your monopoly and alignment issue. Look at the mainstream media. Again, First Amendment, free speech, the media, the free press was there to protect us from our government, not to get in bed with government, not to parrot what the government says. I think we can all agree, whether you're Tucker Carlson or Russell Brand or Tulsi Gabbard or Matt Taibbi, we can understand the mainstream media, which the most people still listen to your point, getting to the other side. Come on, that's corporate owned, that's corporate messaging. That isn't protecting us from government. That's propaganding government on us. I know that sounds sensational, but I think the evidence is pretty amazing. When you take the mainstream media, the Fourth Estate, and the First Amendment, which has been completely, I think, deformed and grotesquely so, and then you add in this creature from Jekyll Island, the central banks, the Federal Reserve, which controls the supply and price of money. Imagine that kind of power in a government, in a centralized government, going debt to centralization. You control the message, the media, the information, and you control the money and the money supply. Those are two very central pieces of control that don't work in a democracy if they're not regulated correctly or they're not doing their jobs. The military industrial complex is just another name for big corporate power too. You've got General Dynamics, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman. These are contractors. They're lobbyists. They sit in the Pentagon. They have security clearance. That should not be in a democracy where those type of corporations with a military interest are making decisions. This is not sensationalism. This is not fable. This is fact. Again, if you look under the hood and see these things, big tech, we all saw, come on, with Google, Facebook, Twitter, the prior version, Microsoft, but that was censorship. Patreon could defund you if you said something the wrong thing about vaccines. Again, I'm not here to say vaccines are right or wrong. It should have been debatable, and you shouldn't be defunded for having the different opinion. That's all I'm saying. This weaponization of the big tech and the weaponization of free speech and the weaponization of things. And of course, big pharma, Pfizer, Moderna, DARPA during COVID. Again, that silver spike in history where people, whether you agreed with it or not, saw incredible amounts of accrual. I saw a profit in a sickness business, not a preventative business. That's just my bias. And then, of course, the other thing that's kind of monopolizes this idea that we have to fight the power and by defunding the police. That's a big meme in America after George Floyd. Very emotional period, but the reaction was an extreme pendulum swing to stupidity. And I am an American. I've been to South Chicago. I've been to West Philly. I've been to Pioneer Square in Seattle. I've been to Third Street Promenade in Los Angeles, Santa Monica. Defunding the police was not a good solution for the rule of law in America. So, and again, now we're talking about making sure that inmates get their transgender surgeries provided to them. What the hell is my answer to that? That shouldn't be a conservative reaction. let's get to the real problems. How have we gotten aligned with this type of control, which makes really bad decisions? Whether that's with our fourth estate, our so-called free press, which is completely co-opted now by corporate agencies. That's not sensational. That's just a fact. You can see it from Fox to CNN. Again, take your pick. It's certainly more to the left now, in my opinion, but there isn't an objective media that calls questions to power and allows for open debate. There certainly is a violation of the antitrust laws in big pharma and big tech that no one's regulating. In fact, the regulatory agencies in America today are run by former CEOs of the companies they're meant to regulate. So the foxes are guarding the henhouse. This, again, is not fable, but fact. I think if more people, left or right or center, understood this, they shouldn't be saying, well, that's a Harris problem or a Trump problem. That's a democracy problem. And we should be galvanized as people who value freedom. That we can disagree on left or right politics and policies, but we should value freedom first and foremost. And that, I think, is a question of being informed and being educated. It doesn't require an Ivy League education. It requires self-education, self-knowledge, self-curiosity. The problem, I think, when a lot of Americans or citizens of the world are broke and they're just worried about getting through the month, they don't have the luxury to look at Fed policy or look under the hood of the deep state, whatever that means, or big pharma or big tech, or how the fourth estate has gone from free speech to co-opted speech. That takes time. And you're frustrated, you're broke, and so you're emotional. And as famously said, if you stand out in the rain long enough to get in anyone's car, you just want to hear what they want to tell you, or you want to believe what they tell you. And yeah, nice tan suit. Or yeah, he has a grandfather-like face. He looks political. Look at Macron. He looks political. People I know went to school and thought he was a psychopath. So again, how you look should not be your haircut. Like Newsom in California. California is an absolute failed policy state. That shouldn't be left or right. The evidence is overwhelming, but he looks presidential. To me, that's sad. But to your point, many people will be enough. And I think that is a sadness of itself. My Pollyannish response of getting informed, getting more knowledge out there. That's the good side of social media or platforms that aren't defunded or canceled, can get more people to at least, hey, this is what Matt and Jesse said. That's what Brent said. That's what Larry said. You don't have to agree with us, but it should raise an eyebrow, get you thinking. That's a positive. Hopefully that gets people not just cynical, but more informed. And hopefully that makes politicians and bankers more accountable. But that's pretty wishful thinking, to your point, given the tide we're fighting against, the emotionalism we're fighting against, the ignorance we're fighting against, and the propaganda, left or right, that we're fighting against. I mean, Rick Rule said to me when we were doing an interview in Vancouver, the fact that we only have to choose between Biden, Harris / Trump, that's the best 380 million Americans can come up with. But then you have to ask, how does the DNC and the RNC work? They select who's going to be in power. That's scary. And so I don't have an easy answer, Jess, because I think the problems are human, all too human. They're based on economics, but they're also based on philosophy and history. It's all a pell-mell. It's all connected. But I do have hope that more people, through platforms like yours and many others, where information is going beyond the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. There's a lot of kooky crazy out there, but there's a lot of sound thinking from Talibi and Tulsi Gabbard, left, right. I'm not seeing too many sound minds from the left. That's my bias right now. But a lot of people I know on the left have gone out of the left because the Democratic Party isn't represented by the current version. It's the inverse of what it used to be. Again, that's a bias. But I can totally recognize why people are concerned about Trump too. I can. But I think the real solution in a democracy is the people. And if the people get informed, this is what Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine said, if the people get informed, then they're going to ask harder questions. They're going to demand more accountability. If they're just going to grab pitchforks, well, we saw how that worked in France or 1917 Russia. That doesn't end well either. So we need more than just anger and emotion or wishful thinking. We need informed population, an educated population, not an identity politics divided population or a distracted population, or God forbid, a population engaged in a war we should never be in.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, you also noted in your recent article the danger of derivatives, which you called levered and cancerous hot potatoes whose degree of risk and intentional confusion will be a party to the next liquidity crisis. Walk us through what could happen if the derivatives market faces a collapse.
Yeah, and again, I don't want to be presumptuous because many people have a very fine understanding of derivative markets. Other people have no idea what they are. And so that's another, I don't want to just walk past that, oversimplify it or overcomplicate it. At 30,000 feet, derivatives are basically, I think, unregulated, illiquid weapons of mass destruction of leverage. They're over the counter, off the bank's balance sheets, and not really reported. And they exist out there. I wrote about this in my anti-hero argument. It's instruments in these options and these call options, long and short, pro or negative, long or short the markets, that have massive amounts of leverage that are hard to understand if it's not something that you're familiar with. But I try to make it simple. I use the example of if I were going to buy a saddle, a horse saddle for $1,000, and I was going to sell it to my neighbor for 1,500. That's an arbitrage, right? That's simple. I buy it online for 1,000, sell it to a neighbor for 1,500. I make 500. Great. That's not necessarily a derivative trade. But if I want to buy that saddle for $1,000, but I only have 10, and I'm going to lever it 100x to buy the saddle, great. I can lever it. I can use $10 instead of 1,000 to buy that saddle. Fine. When I sell it for 1,500, I still make my money. I pay back my margin, and everything's good. But what happens if when I've levered that $10 to 1,000, and the guy I'm going to sell the saddle to is my counterparty is insolvent? Well, then I'm screwed. Then I'm levered and I'm screwed. I'm in what's called an open position. My arbitrage trade for that saddle is not gone as I planned. Now, what happens in the futures market or the derivative market, and this is what I wrote about in this anti-hero book, and I'll get back to the saddle example in a second, but Leo Malamud, with the help of a very young Greenspan and Milton Friedman at the time, decided to take the Merck exchange in Chicago, which is made for farmers, to basically lock in prices on grains or pork bellies to prevent them from getting killed if there's a weather phenomenon. It was a very sleepy, cobweb little building in Chicago. It was designed for farmers. But, decades ago, Leo Malamud had the great idea of let's take the Merck and use it to make futures contracts on currencies. Let's let massive amounts of leverage go in, which should only come out of the mind of a Wall Street magician, one of these anti-heroes. And you go decades forward, and now these contracts are levered 100 to 1, 200 to 1, 300 to 1 on currencies, not on pork bellies and hay. And there's more trading volume levered on that Merck in one day than there used to be in a year. So that's just an example of a weapon of mass destruction concocted by the minds of mathematicians and Wall Streeters looking for creativity, which is just another name for profit and leverage at the expense of massive counterparty risk. On the COMEX market, which is another derivatives desk, so to speak, you have paper contracts representing these hard assets, but there are usually 100 to 300 more contracts than there are actual hard assets. So it's this constant game of open leverage. It's my saddle purchase where I haven't quite found the buyer yet. I've leveraged to get the saddle. Now I got to find the buyer. And to make an example, so I know this sounds complicated, but if you take Deutsche Bank, I wrote an article about this. I'll send you the link. A few years ago, Deutsche Bank had a balance sheet of 800 billion, and its derivatives position was only 1 billion. So that doesn't seem very egregious. But that's another example, like inflation, like employment, like recession definitions, of a complete lie. Because the way it works is when I'm buying that saddle for $1,000, but I only have $10 in cash up, I'm in an open position. My net exposure is only $10 because I've only put $10, but I've really levered 990. So what the banks do, what Deutsche Bank does, is they're in an open position. They don't mark it on the books. It's off the balance sheet. They don't talk about the risk they're taking. They only market to the books once the sale of the transaction is completed, once it's settled. So their net derivative exposure is really just the safe transaction. But while it's still open, while I'm still looking to buy that saddle and sell it to somebody else for a profit, I don't mark it on my books. I don't talk about it. I'm using massive amounts of leverage. So that's my gross leverage. My net position is just a different number. I know this sounds wonky, but the bottom line is Deutsche Bank, $800 billion balance sheet for a bank, 1 billion in derivatives, but its actual open exposure, its leverage was 40 trillion in derivatives. Again, it gets wonky, but they're saying 1 billion in net exposure, but their gross exposure is 40 trillion. And just I think that's 3 times the total GDP of Europe, of the European Union. That's one bank's derivatives exposure. So again, I know a lot of your listeners can describe derivatives far more complicated than me or better than me, and some have no idea what it is. What I'm saying is when you have a bank like Deutsche Bank, which says it only has 1 billion in net derivative exposure, but its gross exposure is really 40 trillion, that tells you the extreme amount of leverage. That's why it's a ticking time bomb, because it only works if all your counterparties are solvent and everything goes as planned. When I buy that saddle for 1,000, I can sell it for 1,500, and my buyer is there with the cash. But what if my buyer's not there? What if he's insolvent? Then I can't pay back my debt, my margin. So you see how it's a roulette wheel that works as long as you're always on the red and everything works. And for years, they just keep churning and churning these contracts. They never take delivery. They just extend and pretend and lever because guys like Leo Malamud and Milton Friedman and a young Greenspan at the time wanted to come up with more creativity. And again, Larry Summers deregulated the derivative markets. He was in favor of that. What happened 10 years later when he was the Treasury Department? The derivative markets imploded in 2008. And he openly mocked the CFTC for trying to regulate it because he was saying bankers know what they're doing. Again, just another anti-hero. These anti-heroes like Malamed, Summers, Greenspan, the list is long and distinguished. I think if more people become informed about these anti-heroic self-seeking measures, they become less emotional and more accountable. They want accountability from these players. I mean, again, the wealth inequality, the salary disbursement, the access to information, the access to capital, the control I think the monopolization of our fourth estate, of the media, of big pharma, of big tech, of the Fed. All of these things are objective empirical realities that are very anti-democratic, led by anti-heroic principles and individuals who are far more interested in self-interest than national interest. And that's why I think the trust is broken. That's why people won't make sacrifices for austerity for their country, because they don't trust the government, because the government isn't being honest about how they've basically for generations now swindled them of their liberties and swindled them of their wealth equality and swindled them of their equal opportunity to the American dream, the pursuit of happiness, because it is a feudalistic society now of lords and serfs, where the top 10 or 1% have far too much wealth. And even if you're a member of the top 10%, it's not safe for you or healthy for you to see this much inequality, a middle class, which is now the working poor in the US. It's appalling. It's appalling. It's not even aspirational middle class, like Scaramucci said. It's desperational middle class. They don't see a way out. Their currency is being debased. Inflation is twice as much as it's reported. Interest rates are higher than they can afford for a mortgage or a car payment. Credit card debt is 22% interest rates. So in addition to the invisible tax of inflation, they have higher interest rates, and then they have to pay income taxes. You net out all that, they basically have enough money to what? Have a hamburger at the end of the week? I mean, it's grotesque. So the hope is lost. The trust is lost. When the trust is lost, you'll believe anyone because they're in a tan suit or they have the right haircut. But I think the better solution is to get informed about the math and the facts. To your point, that's a little harder, takes a little more time. It takes more than one tweet or one article. But all of us, there's something beautiful about being curious. You don't have to be rich or poor, left or right. You can be curious and you can be self-educated. There's power in that. That's invisible wealth. Knowledge to me can't be foreclosed, taken away. It's yours. And if you can see both sides of an argument, you can get educated. You don't need fancy degrees. You can feel empowered, at least with knowledge and not just emotion. And look at both sides of an argument. I think that's fantastic. That's my hope. That's why the Weinstein, Eric, and Brett are out there. That's why Talibi's out there. That's why Tucker Carlson is out there. That's why Tulsi Gabbard is out there. That's why Russell Brand. These are different people from totally different backgrounds and totally different political streams, but they're all kind of saying the same thing. Get informed, question, get some data. Don't just take Brent Johnson or Matt Piepenburg's or Jesse's opinion or Rick Rule's or anyone else's. But we're all fairly similar, I think, in our basic common denominator, that certainly on the market side, that you can't Ponzi a taper scheme. You can't taper, a Ponzi scheme. Must be my painkillers. You can't taper a Ponzi scheme. We're in way too much debt. We don't have the GDP and the tax receipts to pay for it. We're going to debase our currency. That's inflationary. That hurts everyone, but it certainly hurts the middle class the most, who have no backstop. And so you have to hold your politicians and bankers accountable. And you certainly can't defund the police and give monopoly powers to the press, big pharma, and big tech, or the military industrial complex, and think you're going to be a safe democracy, because old men will make policies for young men to go fight their wars, or women too. And lions will continually be led by donkeys in wars that are not necessary, and policies that are not necessary. And I think we have to hold them accountable. I certainly wouldn't want to send my kids to any of these wars. That's for sure.
Yeah, wars is a whole other issue. It's so fascinating to me that people who aren't, forced into war, drafted, so to speak, actually choose to fight in many cases, especially today when you have such blatant corruption in the government, and they're the ones who are giving you the order to go to a foreign land and to engage in combat and risk your own life. It's a tough line to walk, because on one hand you want to appreciate the work that these soldiers
Oh,
and these
absolutely.
people in the military put in, but on the other hand, you also, for myself, I question, like, when you see what the U.S. is doing, for example, why would you want to risk your life for that? That's a whole other conversation I don't want to get into now. Next time I have you on, maybe we will. But I want to extend your discussion on derivatives into gold and silver, because a lot of people, there's theories everywhere from the gold and silver markets are completely manipulated through derivatives, through futures contracts, and that, it's paper gold that represents the price as opposed to actual value of the real bullion. The same goes for silver. There's been a lot of, it's not really conspiracy, because JP Morgan employees have been sent to jail, although, and so people look at that and say that's just a tiny fraction of the actual manipulation that's going on. First, let me just get your thoughts on gold and silver here, where you see them headed, because nominal all-time highs for gold were at 2,500 and change right now. It hit 2,600 at one point recently, and silver cracking $30. It seems to consistently have a problem staying above 30, which then leads to the tweets that say this whole market's manipulated. So first, just your general thoughts on gold and silver here, and second, how much of an impact do you think the paper contracts have on the gold and silver price, and do you see that coming to an end at some point?
Yeah, these are important questions. I mean, in terms of gold and silver, in particular gold, but I'll talk about silver too, because I know there are people interested, but gold is obviously, to me, the primary precious metal that I look at, because I think it's very important. Gold is not an investment. It's not. So you can't compare it to Bitcoin. You can't compare it to the S&P. You can't compare it to NVIDIA. You can't compare it to other deviations in other sectors. The way we understand gold, the way I've understood gold, is a store of value. But by the way, it also has tremendous price optionality. And so it actually has other advantages too. But first and foremost, it's not an investment. And in terms of where I see gold, well, I think we almost answered that in the last 45 minutes of our conversation. When you look at debt, you look at currency debasement, you look at history, you look at political chaos, centralization, desperation. I mean, gold loves chaos, but it also punishes the distortions and the addictions of debt out of control and debased currencies. And so it's not that gold is getting stronger every quarter, every month, every day. It's that currencies, fiat currencies, unchaperoned fiat currencies, are getting weaker, including the mother of all fiat currencies, the home of the world reserve currency, the US dollar, which Brent Johnson correctly said will be the last to die. I don't think the US dollar is going to die even. And if it did, it would be violently, he said. I agree. It's not going to die. It's just going to be repriced. And that's what we're seeing in the gold price. It's in the gold price is not rising again because gold somehow has more properties or more characteristics. It's the same characteristic. It's the same property. It stores its value better than paper money. And so as we go into further debasement, further interest rate cuts, and eventually whether it's Powell's pivot to 50 or 25 bips or whether it goes from QT to QE, the real issue is when we have to monetize our treasury market with money printed out of nowhere, not out of the TGA account, not out of the reverse repo markets, but directly out of the Fed or through some of the Fed banks, through the strategic leverage ratios. But we're going to print more money. We're going to debase the currency, or we're going to have a reset or a nuclear war. But failing nuclear war or some kind of completely chaotic reset, we're going to debase our money further, which is why gold, everyone agrees, is going to go higher, not in a straight line, but higher, because fiat money is dying. Again, you can't taper a Ponzi scheme. So I think that is important. And again, for people that don't follow, and we'll get into the COMEX and gold manipulation in a second, but keep it simple, stupid, because it is ultimately very simple. And as I said, the stupid is simple. What we've done to fiat money since we've gone off the chaperone. In 1920 in America, the average house price was $5,000. And in 1920, gold was $20 an ounce. So if you had a shoebox with 250 gold ounces, you could buy a house. Okay, fine. You could also buy it with 5,000 banknotes from a bank in New York City. Now you fast forward to 2024, and the average U.S. home is 500,000. So that $5,000 in banknotes wouldn't even buy the landscaping for that house. But if you go back to that same shoebox with the 250 ounces, you could still, at the current gold price, buy the average American home. My point is, gold sits there, as Buffett says, and stares at you and does nothing. You're right, it does nothing but hold its value. Well, the US dollar or the yen or the peso or the euro has been very busy all those years losing inherent purchasing power. In the last 4 years, the US dollar has lost 20 to 30% of its purchasing power just on inflation compounding. So you're just running uphill in roller skates. Gold is not making you rich. It's just holding its value better than that dollar. And that's why I think gold's going to continue to go rise. I mean, continue to go higher only because currencies are continuing to be debased, because politicians have put us in a situation where we have no choice but to inflate or die. That's it, or go to war, or both, as Hemingway said, permanent ruin, inflation, and permanent war. I think that's exactly where we are right now. So yeah, gold will get stronger because paper money has no place to go but down, because debts have no place to go but higher, because fiscal spending is out of control, and because no politician will get rid of entitlements or military spending and stay in office. They won't get rid of Social Security. They can't. So politically, they're in a debt trap. And so that to me is the argument for gold in a nutshell. Silver, as Egon says, isn't for widows and orphans. It will rise higher at some point. It's not nearly at its all-time highs or its ratios. The argument against silver, you could argue it's more of an industrial than monetary metal. If we have a major recession, certainly we're seeing in China, there's a slowdown in copper or iron ore. Could that affect the silver price? There are others that say silver is going to 500 next month. Don't fall for that. It's not going to go that fast, that high, in my opinion. But silver will be the little speedboat next to that juggernaut gold. As gold moves slowly up and to the right, eventually I think silver will get its day in the sun. But as Rick Rule also said, you have to be very patient with silver because it rewards infrequently but extravagantly. Many investors can't afford to be patient. That's why they're taking more risk, more leaps on the risk branch for yield in NVIDIA or Bitcoin or other things that they think have a much higher performance, but not a store of value. So I think longer term, the short answer is gold is definitely going to go up because currencies are going to continue to be debased based on all the political fractures and problems and financial realities we just talked about. In terms of the COMEX, again, derivatives, COMEX, the London Exchange, the New York Exchange, the COMEX in New York and London exchanges, yes, there are about 8 or 9 LBMA banks that spend a permanent amount of leverage, as I talked about, open positions to short the gold price and the silver price. Some don't agree. I think the evidence is overwhelming that they've been caught manipulating the gold price. What's happening now in the COMEX, and guys like Andy Schectman follow it far better than me and are far more eloquent in describing it. But I have total respect because I've written about this as well. Well, now the COMEX, those open positions are not just being rolled over or extended; they're taking actual delivery because nations want their gold. They're repatriating their gold and they're taking gold off the COMEX. It's not just a churn and short, where effectively 8 or 9 banks are legally allowed to price control precious metals for a lot of different reasons, which we could spend hours on. But it's basically because a rising gold price is embarrassing to governments and inflated governments. But yes, now with the COMEX, with rising rates, they've had to delever. And more importantly, with the weaponization of the US dollar post-Ukraine, with the rise of the BRICS, with the rise of US debt, with the distrust of the US Treasury, all of these things combined, the world is going, central banks are buying more gold than US Treasuries. The BIS has just made gold a tier 1 asset last year, right alongside the US Treasury. The evidence is overwhelming from central bank purchases in the East, from what the BIS is designating as a tier 1 asset, from what's happening in the COMEX market delivery. Nations want their gold back. They want their chaperone back. They want sound money back. They want that more than a US dollar and US Treasury. To Brent Johnson's point, you still need liquidity. You still need the king of all liquidity, and that's still the dollar. But they want to save in gold and spend in dollars or other fiat currencies. But to have credibility in the next 10 years, the way they see the hockey puck or the polo ball going now, they're turning. And this is open and obvious to me. So yes, the COMEX is changing. Interest rates have affected the COMEX market, but more importantly, demand for actual physical gold is now happening right in front of us. And we see it with central bank purchases. We see it with the balance sheets that are going to get incredibly higher. The average percentage of gold ownership in these central banks and in these nations is going to get higher and higher. And when we get to even a 2% or a 4% allocation in portfolios, the gold price is going to go up 4x or 5x just on supply and demand principles. Again, these are all complicated things, but the simple answer is people, nations, central banks want to save in gold, not in US dollars, US Treasuries. They'll spend in fiat money, but they're going to save in gold. Why? Because the home of the world reserve currency is objectively over its skis in debt and is not trusted since they weaponized the dollar against a major nuclear power like Russia, not Venezuela or not Iran, but a major power already in bed with China and already part of a BRICS membership, which is growing, including Gulf oil states and energy states, which is another conversation entirely about the oil trade in gold. But the evidence is overwhelming. The nations want to save in gold and spend in fiat, and that's going to have a huge impact on the gold price. And why gold and silver are leaving the COMEX is people are taking physical delivery because they no longer want to churn it in this price fixing morass, this cesspool. So all of these things are interconnected, Jesse, because bottom line, America's broke. They've been buying votes. They've got Bernanke and Nobel Prize. They've got all this fantasy that you can live forever on debt, solve it with more debt, paid for with debased money. Well, it's already clear that that's not working. It's already happening. I'm not projecting or predicting this. It's already happening. Look at the bankruptcies. Look at the wealth inequality. Look at the social unrest. Look at the absolutely stupid policies in our State Department, in our Department of Homeland Security. Department of Homeland Security controls the border. We just let in millions of quote unquote legal, illegal aliens. I'm not against immigration. Like Egon, immigration makes countries great, but you can't put too many people in the same lifeboat. And if you let in millions with absolutely no review of their profiles, their backgrounds, you've got cartel members from Venezuela to Mexico running around Ohio and Pennsylvania right now. How anyone at the Department of Homeland Security thinks that's security, you have to ask, what's the real agenda here? Is it to get them to vote for you 10 years from now? That's sacrificing the nation for personal power. And that is corruption of politics. And there are far more self-interested politicians than there are national interested politicians. And that's what we're missing today. Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Why would you do that if you don't trust your politicians to do anything for their country? They're willing to sacrifice millions of dollars, trillions of dollars, thousands of lives to stay in power by making policies that only affect their bottom line, not the nation's. And I think left or right, the more you understand that, the more we have a chance to hold these clowns accountable for the way they've completely mismanaged. To Eric Weinstein's point, they're dead to me now. They're dead to me now. They've lost my trust. And I think that's true from Oliver Anthony to Eric Weinstein to Russell Brand to Tucker Carlson to Tulsi Gabbard to RFK Jr. to whoever you pick. But I think informed people are starting to raise their eyebrows and question the BS, really. And I'm certainly one of them. Don't mean you have to agree with everything I think politically, but the math and history support more centralization, less civil liberties, less personal liberties, more feudalism, masquerading as democracy, and unfortunately, a wealth inequality that's embarrassing for the country that I used to know. Because America in the last 4 to 5 years, I don't recognize has changed so much. Again, from Pioneer Square, Third Street Promenade to South Chicago, it's appalling.
Well, Matthew, this has been a fantastic conversation. Always enjoy talking with you. For those who want to learn more, tell us about Von Greyers and the work you do there.
Yeah, so Von Greyers, we're based out of Zurich. We're the largest gold provider, service provider outside of the commercial banking system. We don't believe if you want to protect yourself from the commercial banking system, you should hold your physical gold in a commercial bank. We have the safest and largest vault in the world in the Swiss Alps. We have other vaults in Singapore and in Zurich. Our clientele is very high net worth. Our minimums are high, but we have a fantastic service, logistics, etc. But our basic thesis is you own gold as insurance for dying fiat money, and you protect it outside of the banking system, and you don't have it in paper ETF form. And so we can find gold for you. We can transport gold anywhere. We can store it and stock it for you. And we have a very good relationship with the refiners. And our main focus is wealth preservation. Certainly, we see, when you look at Egon, who bought gold decades ago at $300 an ounce, it's certainly been wealth enhancement. But more importantly, his motive and the motive for all our clients in over 90 countries is wealth preservation. And that's, at this point, having gone from hedge funds to risk assets, at this point in my life, I'm all about making money by not losing money, by preserving the dollars, the money, the wealth that I have, not in dollars, but in ounces and grams, not in pesos, yuan, or dollars.
Well, I'll put a link to Von Greyers in the description, also to your latest article, some of your other articles. That's another service that you offer on the website. You have free articles there, and they're fantastic, so recommend people check that out. Thank you once again for coming on the show, Matthew, and sharing your knowledge with the audience.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us today. As a reminder, this episode is brought to you by ARC Silver, Gold, Osmium, for all your precious metals needs. Head to arcsgo.com and contact owner Ian Everard today at 307-264-9441 or by email at ian@arcsgo.com, and make sure to tell him that Commodity Culture sent you, and I'll see you guys in the next episode. Commodity Culture is a series on commodities and natural resources. If you would like to see more, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell notification so you're always up to date with the latest episodes.